stream at 560theanswer.com.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy, and President Trump issuing the first veto of his administration, making the case with support from some cabinet officers on Friday, including DHS Secretary Nielsen, who explained what the reality at the border is from a law enforcement security perspective.
The fact that this is an emergency is undeniable. We have not seen this type of flow. As you know, it's predominantly families and children, which means that there's a very unique and dangerous humanitarian crisis at hand, in addition to the security that you just described in your remarks. So we have a duty to know who comes in our country, and we have a duty to ensure that the flow is safe and orderly. That's what you've attempted to do. That's what you've demanded that Congress do. And I just, again, ask Congress to please pay attention. We've given you the facts. The system is breaking. Security is risk, and the very humanitarian protections that we hold dear in this country are at risk in terms of our ability to provide those to vulnerable populations.
And it's not just Secretary Nielsen, also the ICE union, Immigration Customs Enforcement Union, sent President Trump a letter last week prior to his veto, saying in part, every day thousands of illegal aliens are being released into the United States by your administration. Catch and release is not just happening, it's an overdrive. Catch and release must continue, as ICE doesn't have sufficient custody space to hold a massive number of family units illegally entering the United States each day. DHS resources on the border are overwhelmed. Political games in D.C. have rendered the United States completely incapable of controlling its southern border. So the description from Nielsen and the description from the ICE union and the legal judgment of Attorney General William Barr. Remember, sort of an establishment Republican type, right? Rejoins us from his time serving as Attorney General under George Herbert Walker Bush. Here's what Attorney General Barr had to say at that presser.
Mr. President, your declaration of an emergency on the southern border was clearly authorized under the law and consistent with past precedent. As you said, the National Emergencies Act directly authorizes the president, gives broad discretionary authority to the president to identify and respond to emergent circumstances that require a decisive response. And the humanitarian and security crisis we have on the border right now is exactly the kind of emergency that presidents are permitted to address under the National Emergencies Act. As you alluded to yourself, in the past 40 years, there have been 59 emergencies declared. And many of these have dealt with political conditions in countries like Burundi, Sierra Leone, Belarus. The crisis that we're dealing with today is right on our doorstep, and it presents a real, clear, and present danger to the American people. So what you've done from a legal standpoint is solidly grounded in law, and from the standpoint of protecting the American people, it's imperative.
And look, there are constitutional lawyers who I respect, we've had on this show, who disagree with that interpretation, including, say, David French from National Review. Okay. But the suggestion that this veto is usurping the power of Congress and another lurch towards authoritarianism, which is what you heard on cable news all weekend, is just absurd. For more on this topic, and particularly the crime piece of it, which Trump emphasized in his veto message, we're pleased to be joined by John Hinderaker. He is the president of the Center of the American Experiment, and also writes one of the featured contributors at powerlineblog.com, which is one of those must-read blogs that I tell you about. John, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, yeah, good morning, Dan.
Good morning. So what about the veto message and the teamwork that went into that veto message, including with Secretaries Nielsen and Attorney General Barr?
Well, I thought it was impressive, Dan. There's no doubt about the fact that we got an emergency at the southern border. Ask anybody who lives there. They'll tell you. Ask the ICE border agents. The emergency has grown out of years of past practice where we had this policy, and it became widely known in Central America and Mexico that if you show up at the border, bring children. They don't have to be yours, but, glom onto a kid or two, and then sneak across the border. If you don't get caught, go to California. If you do get caught, the first words out of your mouth are, I'm requesting asylum.
Right.
And as long as you've got children, you won't be kicked out. You will be given some kind of a hearing date, and then you just go to California and don't show up at a hearing. And everybody's figured this out, and so we have this deluge of people arriving at the southern border, many of them accompanied by children, maybe their own children, maybe not, who knows. And of course it's an emergency. Of course it's a crisis. And so why is there even a question? Why is there even a problem? Well, there's a problem because the Democrats like this situation. They want millions of illegal aliens flooding into the United States. Why is that? A couple of reasons. Number one, they create a demand for government services. They sign up for food stamps. They go on welfare, and the Democrats love to dole these things out. Number two, you've got the Chamber of Commerce element that likes millions of illegal immigrants because they drive wages down for unskilled labor. And if you are in a labor-intensive industry, that can help you to make money. And so there's a contingency that likes it for that reason. And then the third reason is that the Democratic Party is always looking for voters.
Yeah.
And they know that many of these people who cross the border illegally are going to wind up voting for them in elections, and if they don't, their children will. So the only reason why anybody denies that there's an emergency is because they like the emergency and think they're going to gain from it.
Well, that's the dot connecting, and frankly, the Democrats don't make it that complicated. I mean, there was just a resolution that was supported by a majority of Democrats in the House to essentially support the idea of local units of government providing voting rights to people in this country illegally. So it's pretty straightforward what their end game is. And as we know from the data research, the surest way to make someone a loyal Democrat voter is to get them on the dole.
Yeah, I think you're right. They don't make a secret of it. And, of course, the way the news cycle works, something will happen, a bunch of TV cameras will go down to the border or wherever, and for a couple of days you'll have wall-to-wall coverage of some incident, and then the TV crews go away and they focus on something else. But that doesn't mean the crisis went away. It doesn't mean the emergency went away. And so another news story will come along that reminds us that this is an ongoing disaster at our southern border. I wrote about one of those stories on Powerline. It was just a tragic case of which there have been so many. We've seen so many of these. A 50-something-year-old woman is walking through her neighborhood. Unbeknownst to her, a 24-year-old illegal immigrant starts stalking her. He follows her through the neighborhood. She goes to her house, unlocks her door, and this guy rushes in, and he forces his way in. He stabs and beats her to death. He's caught rather easily, among other things. He took her cell phone, as really dumb murderers do. Mm-hmm. And so, we know that this is the guy who did it. Well, it turns out that this is a guy who has been deported before, who's got a long criminal record. 9 times ICE issued detainer requests for this guy. Think about that. 9 times they found out that he'd been arrested for a crime. He was in the custody of some state or local law enforcement agency. 9 times I said, hold him for us. We need to investigate his immigration history. We think this guy is deportable. But every single time, I think this may have all been in California, every single time he was in a sanctuary jurisdiction and the local authorities refused. They said, no, we don't want to hold him. We're a sanctuary. And they let him go. 9 times. So ICE was obviously onto this guy, right, trying to get him out of the country. And so the disaster didn't end in that case until he finally just brutally, for no particular reason, murdered this 50-year-old woman. So it's stories like that every once in a while will pop into the headlines and remind us that, yes, indeed, this situation is an emergency.
And it's important to note that at that veto press conference, Trump had angel parents there people who've been victimized by people in this country illegally. I want to, and that sort of brings me to this piece that you posted at powerlineblog.com as well about the reduction in violent crime during Trump's tenure as president of the United States. Sort of an interesting connect you made. You think he's changing the culture a little bit, at least as it pertains to law enforcement.
Sure. You know, Dan, it's interesting. I wrote in a different post over the weekend. I guess I was talking about the mass murder down in New Zealand, which the liberals were very quick to blame on Donald Trump as if he had something to do with it.
Right.
That the liberals will give Trump almost superhuman powers. They'll blame him for almost anything that happens around the world. The one thing they won't give him responsibility for is the beneficial effects of his own policies. And we see that very clearly when we look at the crime statistics. And I actually was taking off in this post from a good article in the New York Times, although they scratched their head in a puzzled way about what could cause these trends. So real briefly, Dan, historically the homicide rate in the U.S. has been rather low, about 5 per 100,000. In the 1960s, it took off like a shot. That was a troubled decade, and the homicide rate had roughly doubled by the early 1970s. Stayed high through the 1970s, about 10 homicides per 100,000, dropped off during the 1980s, but not anywhere near as low as it had been. And then in the mid-1990s, it started a long, steady decline. And by about 2014, it was back to where it had been in 1960. So we have lived through this period in which violent crime in the United States has been steadily dropping to about half what it was from the 70s through the mid-90s. That's great. I think that's fantastic. But then what happened? In the last 2 years of the Obama administration, this long-term decline in the homicide rate all of a sudden stopped and was reversed, and the homicide rate jumped up again in 2015 and 2016. And in my opinion, the only plausible explanation for that increase in the homicide rate at the end of the Obama administration is the Black Lives Matter movement and the fact that it was endorsed by President Obama. And the whole point of that movement was to attack law enforcement. And I think those attacks on law enforcement were effective, and I think they resulted in a significant increase in the homicide rate, as well as the violent crime rate generally. Forcible rapes, for example, aggravated assault, those also spiked. Well, then President Trump comes into office in 2017, and what happens? That increase that we saw at the end of the Obama administration stopped, and in fact, a decline began. And in the second year of the Trump administration, 2018, the official FBI numbers won't be out until September. But what the point of the New York Times article was to say that there was a significant drop in murder going on in 2018, very significant drop, based on homicide statistics from 66 large cities. And so I did the math on this, and there's about 5,000 people who were killed in those last 2 years of the Obama administration who would be alive today if the murder rate had stayed where it was before that jump in 2015 and 2016.
But now,
so I think it's a clear example of where a change in the White House made a big difference. I
mean, admittedly, there are a lot of factors that go into that, into what's happening at the local level and the environment too. But so that's one factor you're suggesting.
Well, of course, there's a lot of factors. I mean, demographics are a very important factor. I think that the widespread availability of handguns and the issuance of more carry permits is one of the factors that's brought the homicide rate down since the mid-1990s. But, Dan, ask yourself, this is very weird. We have this historic decline that had gone on for 20 years, steady decline. Now, all of a sudden, we have this 2-year jump. And then what happens when we have the change in administrations and the attacks on law enforcement stop? It starts declining again. I can't think of a reason for that anomaly other than the attacks on law enforcement that were going on with the approval of the Obama administration in the last few years of his administration.
I wanted to switch gears and get your reaction to the college admissions bribery scandal. And this is a piece by Ross Douthat in the New York Times. where he essentially suggests, the argument for meritocracy as the remedy for what we've seen with this scandal, or what we see with the lawsuit filed by Asian American applicants against Harvard for discrimination. Maybe meritocracy isn't the panacea that we believe it is. He essentially suggests that elite institutions, by their nature, are not a mass opportunity system, or not mass opportunity systems. They tend to shape a ruling class, and so more meritocracy argument that argues against both legacies and racial quotas implicitly assumes that some combination of IQ and work ethic is what our elite primarily lacks. But what if it's not that? What if it's more character formation that they lack? And if we weren't so worried, and those elite schools weren't so worried by having the highest ACT, SAT scores and most extracurricular activities within their student body, then perhaps those would be less prominent, and other things like the quality of their character could be more prominent, and that's where we should focus our conversation.
Well, Dan, I don't know how you effectively assess the character of 17, 18, 16-year-old kids. If you could do it,
neither does Ross, by the way.
How those characters are going to develop over the next 50 years, it would be an interesting idea. I'm skeptical that you can do that very effectively. Dan, I'm fine with the idea of meritocracy. Not just in our elite colleges, but throughout our system. And I think the truth is we've got a pretty good system of meritocracy. It's not perfect, by any means, but it's pretty good. And there's one aspect of this, actually a couple quick aspects, Dan, if I can, about this college admission scandal that I want to add to the conversation. The first is that all of these celebrities who bribed people to get their kids into school, I'd never heard of any of them. Celebrities are not what they used to be.
You didn't watch Full House? That surprises
I just
me.
live a sheltered life, but I never heard of any of these people. But the second thing, the point I really want to make, is that one of the things going on here is Title IX. Title IX required the colleges and universities to have equal numbers of male and female athletes in their intercollegiate athletic program. So it's always been true, and it's true today, that there are way more young men than young women who want to participate in sports. And so what that has done is it has created a shortage. It's created a shortage of young women, not to play women's basketball. There's a lot of girls who do that, but in some of the secondary sports. And that's why what we see here, it's so funny. Somebody bribes the women's crew coach at USC to secure the admission of a girl who's never rowed a boat in her life.
Right.
And the reason for that is, there's not a lot of girls who want to go out for crew. In fact, I didn't realize there was such a thing as women's crew. That was news to me. And so this corrupt Title IX system, which forces the universities to artificially inflate the number of young women who are participating in intercollegiate sports, I think it's part of the story here, because that's the loophole that some of these people exploited to get their kids into school by pretending that this young woman wants to row a boat.
There you go. He is John Hinderaker. He's the president of the Center of the American Experiment. And again, Powerline blog is where you get his musings and insights along with those of his colleagues. It's a must-read on a daily basis. John, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. Have a great day.
You
Bye-bye.
too. And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.
Connect with Dan and Amy using the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560.